But for the grace of God, what would I be? Nothing I do can change His love for me. He is deserving of more than all I can give. But in the grace of God, I'll ever live. But for the grace of God, what would I be? Nothing I do can change His love for me. He is deserving of more than all I can give. But in the grace of God, I'll ever live. So in the grace of God, I'll ever live.
Well, good morning. I want to say thank you to those of you who have commented that you've been enjoying these video sermons. Although one guy told me that he likes them and thinks I ought to go to them all the time because he likes to be able to hit the pause button whenever he wants to. And, that didn't really bother me because in 40 years of preaching, I'm pretty certain there's people who hit the middle snooze button during my sermons, so I can deal with the pause button. I don't think I've ever told you about Arthur Joe Potter. Arthur Joe was a member of the church that Cheryl and I were at before we came to Park Meadows. Arthur Joe was a very hard-working man. He worked long hours, and then he came home. He hadn't gardened, and some of you know how much work that took. But anyway, the thing about Arthur Joe is he usually slept during my sermons. Well, one Saturday night, we were having a church fellowship, and we were playing 42. I don't know if you're familiar with the game 42. It's a game played with dominoes. It involves a lot of strategy and a lot of skill. It's a game you play with partners. Anyway, Arthur Joe was my partner, and he was a very good 42 player. He could tell, just after a few plays what everybody else had in their hand, and he was very good at it. Anyway, it was his turn to play. He had his head down, and he was deep in thought about what his next play was going to be. And we sat patiently and waited about 30 seconds, and he hadn't played. And about a minute, he hadn't played, and about a minute and a half, he hadn't played. And finally, someone would say, "Arthur Joe, are you going to play?" And he had been asleep during the game of 42. So after that, whenever I'm preaching and Arthur Joe went to sleep, I really wasn't very much offended by it. Over these past weeks, we've been talking about God is. We've said God is love. We've said God is our hope. We said God is holy. This morning, we want to continue that series as we're focusing on some of the attributes and qualities of God. And I want to talk to you about how God is everywhere. You might remember the name Galileo. He was in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He is considered the father of modern physics, which is kind of interesting because it's 500 years ago. But he's considered the father of modern physics. He studied speed and velocity. He studied gravity and free fall. He studied inertia and pendulums and other aspects of physics. I remember being taught that he climbed to the top of the Tower of Pisa, which I thought was pizza, but it's not, Pisa, P-I-S-A. And he dropped two objects from the top of the tower, seeing if a heavy object fell faster than a lighter object. Now, he was a great scientist. He was very influential and very significant in the development of our understanding of science and of physics. But here's the thing about it. Galileo never invented a single law of physics. Galileo didn't design anything about physics. Galileo simply studied and noted and then recorded what it was that he saw in physics. It is God that created everything. God created the universe. And in that, God also created everything that is true in the world of physics. But the thing about it, God is separate from His creation. God is not governed at all by any law of physics. Now, one of the most basic laws of physics is that any one object cannot occupy more than one space at any given point in time. But God is not governed by that law of physics. God can be everywhere. Now, theologians through the years have used some terms to describe the character or nature of God, and they use the prefix omni, O-M-N-I. Omni is a Latin term meaning all. God is omnipotent, He's all-powerful. God is omniscient, He's all-knowing. This morning we want to talk about the third omni that is often used, omnipresent, which simply means God is everywhere. God is always present. God is not limited to being at one point at any given time. God can be everywhere. He's all present. Now, we can know this, and we can affirm this, and we can say this, but we live in a world that's governed by the law of physics, and our minds just have this default setting that we are aware of the law of physics. And so when we hear the term God is everywhere, our minds find that difficult to comprehend. This is true in all spiritual things. We try to understand spiritual things, or we want to understand spiritual things, when we're governed by the physical laws of the universe. We're governed by physics. Now that presents a quandary. The only solution, the one and only solution to that quandary is faith. Jesus said one time, "Blessed are those who believe even though they don't see." That's the basic idea of faith. It's believing what we cannot see. It's knowing what we cannot understand. So let's talk about this idea that God is everywhere. First of all, let me say that God is not limited by social distancing. He never social distances. I think that's funny. I've been preaching 40 years. I have never used that point. 30 days ago, I didn't even know of the idea of social distancing. Now it's common to hear that in our world. But God does not do social distancing. There is no place that God's not there. There is no difficulty that we can encounter that God is not with us. I want us to look at the 139th Psalm and look how the psalmist expressed this idea that God's everywhere, that wherever he went, God was with him. He writes in verses 2 through 12 of Psalms 139, "You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, O Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like day, for darkness is as light to you." Those are beautiful words, beautiful imagery. They tell us that God is everywhere. Now I want to ask a question now. This reality that God is everywhere, is that good or is that bad? I think most people would say, oh, it's good. That's the answer I'm supposed to give. It's good. But you know, that idea of God being everywhere is good or bad depending upon your point of view and your idea, your concept of God. If you see that God is watching, looking, keeping oversight over you to see if you're doing something wrong, if you think that God is watching and He's going to judge where you go and what you say and what you do, this whole idea that God is everywhere might not be that great of an idea. There's a children's song that really has bothered me for years. It's a cute little song. It's got cute little motions. It's sung by cute little kids, but the message of it is absolutely horrible. In fact, the man who wrote it, I think he should be ashamed for the image that he has placed in tens of thousands of preschoolers, the image that he's placed there of their idea of God. The song is entitled, Be Careful Little Eyes, and the words go to this effect. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. And then this next part, you shake your finger and you have a scowl on your face. Your Father up above is looking down in love. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. It goes on, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little mouths, what you say. You know the message of that? The message is you better be careful because God is watching and He's listening. And He's going to look down from heaven and He's shaking His finger at you and He's going to zap you with lightning or something as He's looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. Now, people that have that distorted image of God, they are not at all comforted by this idea that God is everywhere. But those of us who know of the God that Jesus spoke of, we find that very comforting. We find that very encouraging that we're never alone. We're never on our own. The God that cares for the flowers of the field, the birds of the air, that God is watching us, not to look down and catch us doing something. He's watching us with love and compassion as He seeks to provide for us and take care of us. We don't see God as a big policeman in the sky that's monitoring us. We see God as a God of love, that He's our hope, He's our strength. He's our sheltering rock of comfort. And so when we have that perception of God, we're comforted by this idea that God is everywhere. Well, the last question I want to ask is, what does God's being everywhere, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for me? Well, it means that no matter where we go, God is there. It means that God is always with us. He's not looking down on us, but through His Spirit, He's present in our lives. He's living in our hearts. I want you to think for a moment about the disciples, the 12 men, and there were others, but those 12 men that followed Jesus during His 3 years here on earth. They heard Him speak. They witnessed as He performed miracles. He once told them that if you see me, you see the Father. If you hear me, you hear the Father. And through Him, they developed a totally new concept and a totally new idea of God. Each morning, they were comforted when they would awake because He was present. Each evening, as they lay down to sleep, He was nearby. He fed them. He took care of them. At different times, He rescued them. Each day, they followed Him. Then at the end of the 3 years, He began to say, I'm going to go away. And the place I'm going to is a place that you're not going to be able to follow me. Well, they were devastated. Why would He go away? And they were devastated. What are they going to do? How can they get by if He's not there? And they were wondering, how is it that He could go away? How is it that He could leave them? And why would He go someplace that they could not follow Him? Then He spoke some words that had to be very confusing to them. He spoke some words that they just could not truly understand. It's recorded for us in John chapter 16. He's one of the disciples that heard those words. John chapter 16, verse 7. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send Him to you. They were terrified that He was going to leave. But He says, it's going to be better for you. It's going to be to your advantage if I go away. Well, how could that possibly be? How could it be that Him going away would be good for them? That it would be of advantage to them? You know, it must have been amazing to walk and talk with Jesus. But remember that when Jesus was on this earth, He was restrained by the law of physics. He could not be with John and at the same time be with Peter if Peter were somewhere else. He could only be at one point in time, one point in space. He was limited by the law of physics. But then He left. But then at Pentecost, he came back. But he didn't come back in a physical body governed by the law of physics. You see, it was to their advantage. It was better for them. It's estimated that there are approximately 2 billion Christians living in the world today. They're dispersed over every continent, every nation. But it's not that God segments himself into 2 billion parts, and a part of God is with every Christian. The reality, God not being bound by physics, God not being bound by the rules that govern our world that we understand, God is able to be everywhere with everyone at the same time. Not a part of God, not a fragment or a fraction of God, but God is able to be with anyone, everyone, all at the same time. So where are you today? Well, God's there. Where are you emotionally? God's there. Where are you in your fears? God's there. Where are you in your problems? God is there. God's everywhere. He's always with us. One of the most meaningful experiences of my life was the 2 years that I was the chaplain at Willowbrook Hospital. Now, some of you will not be familiar and not remember Willowbrook. It's the building right across from our church that is now Life School. Before that, it was SkillsNet. But in the late 80s and early 90s, it was Willowbrook Hospital. It was an inpatient facility that they could have about 60 residents. Some of them had alcohol, drug difficulties. Some of them were in for rehab. Some of them were there because of emotional problems and emotional mental situations. I did a worship teaching service every Sunday morning at 8:30 before I would come across the street here to preach at Park Meadows. And then each day of the week I did a devotional. You know, I still look back 30 years ago, but I remember those times. And I still periodically have patients come up to me, former residents, patients come up to me, and they will tell me something I said, something that I taught, something that I was discussing about God that they still remember. I remember some of the things that they said. In particular, there has been one thing that I've never forgotten because I heard it several times. And remember, some of those people were there because they were dealing with depression and they'd reached the point, clinical depression, they needed treatment. And I remember something that they told me often right prior to their release. And basically, here were their words. They would say, I was in a deep hole of depression. And I felt that God had deserted me. In fact, I sometimes thought that maybe there's no God at all. But after I came out of that hole of depression, I realized that God had been with me all along. Yes, He had. God is everywhere. He's with us right now. Now, I hope that I have given you something to think about. I hope that I have given you something that might be an encouragement to help you with whatever you're going through right now. And I hope that you will be comforted by this idea that God is everywhere.